So welcome everybody to Democrats Abroad Environment and Climate Crisis Council Monthly Climate Cafe. I am Dana Freeling, the chair of the ECCC, calling in from my home in Finland, as I said. I did recently visit my home state of Texas, which is experiencing record heat averages. Climate change is here, sadly. We are in a climate emergency, which must be recognized as such. If you have not signed DA's petition to Biden to declare a climate emergency, Angela will be posting that in our link just now. So please find it in the link. And if you haven't signed it, please go now and sign it. We'll be joining with the DNC. They are also disseminating a similar petition, and it will be delivered to the White House at the end of September. A lot can be done by declaring a climate emergency. In the meantime, I hope everyone is staying safe and cool as record heat indexes are surpassed globally. I guess you all know that the world has now surpassed this average temperature. It's very alarming. But thank you for joining us for our July Climate Cafe, where we will take a deep dive into the development of cell-cultured meat and its potential to both mitigate climate change and limit animal cruelty. We are so honored to welcome Robert Jones from Mosa Meat as our special guest for this fascinating discussion. Robert Jones is the head of public affairs for Mosa Meat, the Dutch food technology startup that pioneered the first cell-cultured beef in the world. His role at the company is to safeguard the political environment in which regulatory decisions are made that impact Mosa's products. As a part of that work, he helped launch Cellular Agriculture Europe, the continent's first trade association for cell culturing companies. Based in Brussels, it represents 13 startups across Europe and Israel that will seek novel foods approval for cell-cultured animal products. Previously, Robert acquired 22 years of experience in government affairs, advocacy, and communications, including holding positions such as director at the Environmental Defense Fund and as an appointee by the U.S. Secretary of Commerce. He holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Texas, a master's degree from George Washington University, and is a graduate of the Culinary Institute of America. Robert is also a valued member of the Democrats Abroad community. He resides in the Netherlands and, like myself, is a Texas voter. Thank you so much for your advocacy, Robert. I'd like to hand you the floor now.
Great, thank you, Dana. I appreciate the introduction. I am a proud Texan most of the time, and a proud DA member. My wife and I moved abroad almost 3 years ago now for my career, and really enjoying our time in Europe, but I do miss being in the thick of the politics in the US sometimes. I would say that I've been involved in Democratic politics for my entire life, having been raised by a single mother who was a Democrat, and then started my career working on campaigns in the U.S. Right out of college, I was involved in a number of elections, quickly fell into the niche of working for pro-choice Democratic women. And I ran a number of campaigns and luckily fell into the good graces of Emily's List, and worked my way up the ranks at Emily's List. I was eventually the political director for Emily's List in Washington, D.C. In the early aughts, and was involved in hundreds of races, helping elect women up and down the ballot from the U.S. Senate, Congress, governor's mansions, major mayor's races, and loved that work. But the more I got involved in helping elect women to office, the more I got pulled into their public policy challenges, and helping them govern. And one of the stickiest of those was having helped elect the first gay mayor of a major American city, Anise Parker in Houston, and who had a very wicked environmental challenge in the port of Houston. And helping her with that ultimately led to being an environmental lobbyist for the Environmental Defense Fund. And I've never really looked back. I've been focused on environmental issues since then. I've had a super strong passion for food my entire life. I was an amateur home cook, and began thinking about the intersection of food and climate a long time ago. And really all roads lead back to livestock when you think about how does our food system impact the climate crisis. And so I knew eventually I wanted to work at the intersection of climate and food. And that's led me where I am today. I will say, she mentioned I was a graduate of the Culinary Institute of America. I want to be clear, I'm not a legit chef. I went to culinary school for fun as part of a 12-month sabbatical in between jobs, because I wanted to immerse myself into the food system and really understand how the service end of the food system works, as part of really understanding how to work in alternative protein and ultimately the climate crisis. So I'll start sharing my screen and tell you a little bit about the work that I do today, now that I've left the day-to-day hardcore of Democratic politics. Is that sharing? Okay, great. So yeah, I landed in a very interesting space in the food system. I knew I wanted to work at the intersection of climate and food, and had an excellent opportunity to pivot and coming to Mosa Meat in the Netherlands, which was really the pioneer of growing meat from stem cells, and which was a game-changing event, and I knew was going to be really important for the alternative protein space. And I'll tell you all about the technology and how we make it, because I'm sure, and I'll leave a lot of opportunity for questions at the end. It won't be a very long presentation, because I know you obviously will probably have a lot of questions about this new, weird, interesting, novel technology. I wanted to give a little bit of a disclaimer at the top, is that you'll see a variety of food photos in the course of my slides. These slides, including this delicious pork belly in hoisin sauce, are actually product grown in a bioreactor. This pork belly was taken from a sample of cells from a pig that was never killed. And so you're seeing an incredible food product here, grown with our technology, without ever slaughtering the animal or the byproduct that comes with that, including the climate impact. So all of the food slides that you see, delicious food slides you see here, are products that are grown with the technology that I'm going to describe today. And at the end of the day, what I really am concerned about is making delicious food that hardcore carnivores like myself would be interested in switching to, in order to change our behavior towards a positive direction that is better for the environment, but also better for animals if animal welfare is a concern for you. But let me start with the why. I don't want to preach to the choir here. I know we're all progressive. I know we're all forward thinking. We already know that there is a climate crisis. Where things get lost sometimes that frustrate me is that the world is very focused on the impact of energy and transportation on climate, but we oftentimes forget the impact that food has on climate. In reality, 30% of greenhouse causing gases come from agriculture. They come from the systems that we've built to make our food every day. And that is not very well carried through the conversation about climate. And if you really drill down on the numbers, you see that the majority of that impact actually comes from animal agriculture. And that it's a double whammy because with animal agriculture, it's not just the methane and the greenhouse causing gases that the animals produce themselves. It's the process of making the food in order to feed these animals. So, for example, the vast majority of feed for cattle in the world is corn and soy. The vast majority of that soy is coming from the Amazon, where they've torn down the forest in order to grow soy, to ship it around the world in order to feed cattle, which require an exorbitant amount of water. Land use is skewed, and then produce lots of CO2 and methane, which is about 100 times more potent than CO2. All in all, livestock alone account for about 14 to 20% of greenhouse causing gases, more than all cars, to give you perspective. And about 80% of all of the agricultural land in the world that we're using is for livestock production, 22% of the water, 80% of all the antibiotics that are produced on the earth are for animals in order to keep them healthy, for us to eat them. And all in all, we're slaughtering about 205 million animals per year. And so it is an incredible impact on the planet that oftentimes get lost in the conversation. There is a $1.4 trillion US meat market today, annually, that is expected to grow to about 1.8 trillion. And I'll talk a little bit more about that growth and what it means. But what we do know is that the current way that we produce meat, it has a tremendous impact on the planet, and needs to be changed. And that's just status quo. It doesn't even account for the incredible increase in population that we're seeing, and the demand for meat. And then finally, as a culinarian, and again, as a classically trained chef, while there is some really great plant-based alternatives coming onto the market, they just don't meet the culinary sensory requirements of the average meat eater. Even with cool stuff like Impossible burgers that are made with, the hemoglobin that makes it almost look like it's bleeding or like it's cooking from raw to medium rare, they're not gaining significant traction. And so early on, I think people in the alternative protein space identified that if we're really going to make an impact on meat production, you have to provide a complementary protein that meat eaters will enjoy enough and at the price point that is comparable, in order to switch their behavior. So I'll pause here for a second and say, for those of you who are particularly decadent, I would highlight this incredible foie gras here. I have had this product myself. It's a Parisian-based company with two friends of mine that are co-founders. And this foie gras you're seeing is made from a sample of fertilized duck eggs and actually grown in a bioreactor. And you get this incredibly decadent product. And it gives you an example of the quality of food that our industry has the potential to make at mass scale. But how do we do it? So I think this is the biggest question, right? It's just like, well, what is this? We generally refer to it as cellular agriculture. And that's because it's a process of making the same animal food-based products that you're used to from their building blocks, the cells themselves, without raising and slaughtering the entire animal. And by taking a sample of cells from an animal and what's called proliferating them into just the tissue, the meat that you eat, you can make pretty much any animal product. You can make beef, you can make pork, chicken, duck, foie gras, as you've seen, dairy, and there's even a company now in the Netherlands that's focused on making leather. They're just growing skin cells from cattle that can be tanned into leather without ever needing the animal. You can do this in a couple of ways. Generally, you take a sample of cells from a live animal through a process called a biopsy with the assistance of a veterinarian who uses a little bit of anesthesia, takes a sample of tissue like the size of the tip of your fingertip without any harm to the animal, or you can draw stem cells from a fertilized egg in the example of like a duck or a chicken or fish. So there's a variety of ways to do it, but you do not need to kill or cause harm to the animal in order to get a sample of those cells. Once you have a sample of cells, you take them and you isolate down to the healthiest, most active stem cells or satellite cells. And for those of you who, it's been a while since you've been in a science class like me, a stem cell is generally a reference to what's called a pluripotent cell, or it means a cell that doesn't know what it wants to be when it grows up yet, right? It has the potential to basically become any type of cell in the body, whether it is an organ like the liver or the heart or skin or hair or muscle or fat. It basically has all of the DNA it needs to grow up and become what you tell it to become. We take that sample of cells and we first start with a very small, what's called a bioreactor. Imagine like a stainless steel vessel, in the 40-liter range, and we put that cell in a really nutrient-rich broth that is most minerals, all of the nutrients that, for example, a cow would have turned grass into in its 3 stomachs, and breaks it down. We just introduce the raw nutrients. And we hold that liquid broth at the temperature of the animal. So, for example, a cow is about 38.6 degrees Celsius. So the process of introducing this nutrient-rich environment and a really cozy, warm environment that's like the temperature of the animal triggers the cells to do what they would have done in nature, which is to multiply by orders of magnitude. So an original sample like the size of a peppercorn, you may have several 100,000 satellite cells. In a matter of days, you are in the billions and then the trillions. And they're doing what they do in nature and multiplying. Once you have all of those cells, then you move them to a new environment with a little bit different diet and what we call growth factors, which are natural and we isolate from plants. And the growth factors are the point where it stimulates the cell to become something. And in our instance, with my company, we are laser focused on beef for climate reasons. And we make muscle tissue and fat tissue separately. And so we tell the cells to become muscle strands or to become fat. And then they do that, and then they what's called differentiate out into the final product. And you get what you see here in the graphic. You're basically getting muscle strands that are not attached to anything because they're not growing on bone, or joints. They're free floating. And you get long muscle strands. And then you do what you do normally with beef. You have muscle and fat, you put it through a meat grinder and recombine it to create the burger experience or the meatball that you are used to buying at any grocery store or restaurant you've ever been to. And so the final product is ultimately exactly what you're used to, like a burger or chicken nuggets or a chicken breast. Just we don't need to do all of the extras like grow skin and bones and hair and all of the things that you don't actually need. And in that regard, it's actually a fairly efficient process because, for example, a cow is a beautiful animal, but it's not a super efficient meat producer. A cow will produce about 1 calorie of meat for every 13 calories of feed that you give it. So the food feed conversion ratio is actually pretty poor. Whereas because we're just making an edible product and everything you need, our food to feed ratio is more in the 80 percentile. And so we can realize incredible efficiencies that the animal cannot do in nature because they have a much bigger purpose than just being eaten. For those that might be wondering where this technology came from, it's actually Dutch originally. It's European. But was funded by a Dutch government grant. This is my co-founder in the photo. His name is Dr. Mark Post. Mark's a fascinating guy. He's a cardiac doctor who specialized in tissue engineering. He taught at Harvard Medical School for years. And then he and his wife decided to move back to the Netherlands, and he began teaching at the University of Maastricht in the south of the Netherlands. And then our other co-founder is named Peter Verstrada. He worked for a major meat company, and he was a meat scientist. And they got pulled into a Dutch government consortium that was put together in 2004 to explore the idea of making food using human medical tissue engineering practices. And they ran out of the grant before they made a breakthrough. But they published a bunch of papers. And interestingly enough, one of the people who read their peer review research was a guy named Sergey Brin. And if that rings a bell, that Sergey Brin is the co-founder of a small company called Google. And Sergey Brin called Mark up one day out of the blue and said, "Hi, I'm Sergey Brin. I'm super rich. I'd like to help you. Is this technology bullshit, or can you really do it?" And Mark said, "Yeah, we can do it, but it's at a pharmaceutical grade at very small scale. This was meant for human medical purposes." And Sergey Brin said, basically, "You're never going to get traction with this unless you have a proof of concept you can show the world. So what would it cost to grow 3 pounds of meat?" And they did some back of the napkin math and said, basically, it's about $1 million US. And he said, "No problem. I'll fund it. You got 9 months. Let me know how you do. I don't want any equity. I don't care. I just want to prove that this can be done." They did it in 8 months, called him, and he put in another $500,000 for a huge public event in London where he hired Edelman to manage it. And they debuted this burger in 2013 to the world on a stage in London. And it really started a space race that has now led it to about 150 companies worldwide, because the original research was all open access. It was not protected by IP, which they wanted. They wanted mass scale adoption. And now they formed a company shortly thereafter, which is Mosa Meat, where I work. And there's been billions of dollars put into advancing this field, though it's still very nascent. It's still very new. So the wicked challenge which we face, which I think you're aware of, is that not only is the current way that we're making meat unsustainable and a huge driver of climate change, unlike transportation, where EVs and electric vehicles are getting high levels of adoption now, and there's major reforms in transportation and energy, agriculture is still on a very unsustainable path. In fact, because of the Western example that we've set for the world, you have a rising middle class in India and China that now want to eat meat as a status symbol and a luxury item, and meat consumption is skyrocketing. And in fact, is expected to rise by as much as 50 or 70% by 2050. At the same point, we're going to have 10 billion people on the planet. If you tried to use today's meat production methods to meet that demand by 2050, you would need 2.5 planet Earth's worth of land and water. We are at planetary boundary now, and we just cannot do that, which means that you have to figure out a way to make this protein for this growing planet and this growing desire for meat in a new way. And it's not to replace all animal agriculture, it's to complement that rapidly rising demand. So we believe in a future where there's cultivated meat like what we're making. There's lots of plant-based products. There's lots of alternatives, like through precision fermentation, like really cool stuff that's happening like with mycelium and mushrooms, and reforming conventional agriculture with more regenerative practices, and more methane capture barns, all of these things have to happen together. We know so far through peer-reviewed research and data provided by the companies that are doing this, that if you use renewable energy to produce your meat, because we're essentially electrifying meat production and centralizing it, if you use renewable energy to do that, you can cultivate meat at as much as a 93% lower carbon footprint, using 95% less land and 78% less water. Now, the argument for cultivating beef is much stronger, and that's why we're focused on doing that. I mean, it's incredible scores, especially because of the methane. The argument for cultivating chicken is lower, because the primary reason to make chicken using our technology is really more about an animal welfare concern than an environmental concern. But everyone comes to this with a different reason, and all the companies have different motivation. Several of the major agencies that we're all familiar with, McKinsey, Deloitte, A.T. Kearney, have all taken a look at this industry and think there's large potential. This is an A.T. Kearney study from a recent one that said that they expect the global meat market to grow to 1.8 trillion by 2040. And that as early as 2030, that cultivated products may make up as much as 10% of the market share. And you'll see in this chart, an interesting thing starts to happen. One is that by 2030, you start to see a decline in plant-based adoption. And that's just, again, because of that rising middle class in Asia that already have plant-based diets today, and they're switching to meat. And that's part of the problem. But you do see some positive news that like 2035, a narrow majority of the combined cultivated and plant-based products outtake conventionally slaughtered meat. But you can see that this has to be a diverse portfolio all the way through, and you have to reform and add all of these tools to the toolbox. So that's why we came together as a group of companies in Europe to combine forces and really advocate for our industry in Brussels and London to get government support, like the original grant in the Netherlands, to launch this industry, because we know no one company can really do this. We need broad support. The US has really become the standard bearer on this now, with 2 executive orders from Biden in the last 11 months. That have accelerated our industry and really set a strong standard. But I serve as president of our industry association, CellAg Europe, so I spend a lot of my time in Brussels lobbying the European Parliament and the European Commission, trying to make sure that we're included, that we have a smooth regulatory approval process, but also that we're included in a lot of the public policy decisions leading up to COP28, in particular, where I will have a strong presence. We have companies, as Dana said, from all over the world. Though we're a European association, obviously Europe has a very strong tie with Israel. So we have several Israeli companies. We have a Swiss company, even though they're not technically in the EU. And then we have several UK-based companies as well that I represent in my lobbying in London and Brussels. I'll very quickly touch on this because I know some of you will be thinking to yourself, this sounds really interesting, but is this safe to eat, right? This seems like a little bit scary. So I think it's worth mentioning the process that we have to go through as companies in order to get to market in the first place. And it is very robust. Both the US and Europe have very strong food safety cultures and very robust food safety laws. In Europe, we have to go through what's called the Novel Foods Law. And it's kind of an arbitrary line, but anything that was not widely eaten before May 15th, 1997 is considered a, quote, novel food. And you have to go through this regulatory framework. And it has 2 phases. One is a common risk assessment, which is standard in food. where we present samples of our product and we present data and analytics that's been done by third-party laboratories that are approved in advance by the European Food Safety Authority. They examine those, they do samples of those products for allergens, heavy metals, contaminants. They look at any of the compositional data, toxicological data. They examine what we want to call it, how it would be used, and they do what's called an intake assessment, where they guess, you know, if you're making a burger and the average European eats this number of burgers a week, what might be the impact on their health. This process can take 1.5 to 2 years alone, the risk assessment. So it is very thorough, and really Europe probably has the best food safety system in the world. It is the gold standard. So when you get an approval in Europe, it's oftentimes accepted in other places in the world, including the US. But it doesn't stop there. Then you go through a political process as well, where the European Commission then has to examine the food safety review that you've gotten and make decisions about whether or not to authorize you, and what your product should be called, how it has to be labeled. And ultimately, all 27 member states in Europe get a vote on this. And you have a pretty high bar to pass. You have to win 55% of the vote, and that 55% has to represent 65% of the EU population. So we really have to make sure that we've convinced big countries like France and Germany and Romania and Poland and Italy and you know, and then work our way down to make sure that we keep above that 65% threshold. This is a good thing, because we have to work with then at the national level and make sure that they understand our products and the role that they might play in their individual national climate goals and their animal welfare goals. As I mentioned, this isn't just about regulatory. This is about us as an industry communicating what we bring to the table. And for those of you who are in Europe, you probably know that we have the farm to fork strategy, which is part of the European Green Deal. And there is an entire new framework being applied to agriculture in Europe, and understanding how for the entire value chain of food, from raising and slaughtering an animal or picking produce all the way to the fork, the impact that it has, the supply chain, and how it can contribute to goals. And we're making a strong argument that we need to be explicitly included in this legislation. And one of the top reasons is that Europe also has a very healthy appetite for meat. And right now, we are not making enough meat in Europe to feed Europeans. And so we are still importing up to €4 billion a year in beef. Most of it is coming from Brazil. And most of that is much of that is associated with illegal deforestation of the Amazon. So you're simultaneously contributing to CO2 and methane and destroying the major carbon sinks of the planet. And it's a double whammy. And so we're advocating to make sure that the import standards for Europe include a consideration of deforestation, including animal feed, and that our products could help offset some of these concerns. But it's not just Europe. As I said, there's really a space race going on around the world right now in this technology, including in the US. President Biden has been incredible in advancing alternative proteins, and especially biotechnology and biomanufacturing of food and alternative proteins. The USDA has committed $10 million to Tufts University to establish the National Institute of Cellular Agriculture. China has now included cellular agriculture in its 5-year food strategy, and that really got everybody's focus because, I mean, obviously, when China, you know, considering the demand for protein there, when they make a decision like this to put state support behind Hispanic, and continues to be an incredible supporter, and just committed $60 million to create a startup ecosystem. Even the UK post-Brexit has included an international food strategy. There's 2 approvals for cultivated chicken in the last 3 weeks in the United States. And that has already been sold. One at Dominic Cren's Michelin star restaurant in San Francisco, and the other at Chef Jose Andres' restaurant in Washington, D.C. Cultivated chicken was served at COP 27 and will be at COP 28 again, including to John Kerry, who I had the great pleasure of meeting. There was a lot of activity around this technology around the world. That all said, I'm obviously a proponent of this technology, but I will give you the caveat. I'm not standing in front of you today and saying that this is the silver bullet that's going to solve the climate contributions of food. It is not. It is a tool in the toolbox. It is one of many that we're going to need to employ. We're going to need to incorporate more regenerative agriculture and reforms to how we make meat now, the old school way. We're going to have more plant-based products. We're going to have more precision fermentation, cultivated meat. And we're going to have to, more and more people are going to have to consider whether or not meat should be part of their diet at all. My founder, again, is a cardiac surgeon. He's the first person to tell you you should not eat more red meat. It's not good for you. It's not good for the planet. But if you're going to do it and you cannot break that addiction, then you should consider alternatives like the products that we're making. So I'll stop there because I think you probably have a lot of questions. Those of you, I met some of you at the DA meeting in Washington, D.C., which was awesome. For those of you who we haven't met or connected yet, this is a QR code to my LinkedIn page, and I would be happy to connect with you and take any questions you might have.
Thank you so much. Do you want to now stop sharing and we'll go on to a Q&A? That was absolutely incredible. I learned so much. I'm going to try and not be selfish and dominate all the questions. Where to start? I'm wondering, we are trying to save energy and in the production, I want to ask something first about the production. So what kind of energy usage and water usage are you able to use renewables in this production? Does it take a lot of energy to produce it? Does it take a lot of water to produce it? Do you need to be utilizing antibiotics to produce it? So my first question, and then everybody, please put your hand up, star hand up in the chat, and we will get to everybody's questions. Thanks. Thank you so much, Robert.
No, those are all good questions. So let me start with the last one first, because it's not something I got into. One of the things that's really interesting about this technology is that because you don't have to aggregate a bunch of animals for fattening them up in the final 6 weeks of their life and have them in close proximity, you don't have the risk of zoonosis and disease like you do in traditional operations. And especially some of the meat production in the U.S. cattle production in the U.S. is mostly very humane, and it's not as much a concern. The further you get down, pork, chicken, there are concerns with animals being on top of each other and disease outbreaks and health. And especially in poultry, there's a lot of antibiotics use. It's part of the reason that we have such a serious challenge with antimicrobial resistance in humans. Now it's because we're getting so much exposure to antibiotics through meat that we're eating. And so that is especially true in Asia, where they have, high rises that are just hundreds of thousands of pigs on top of each other, 27, 30-story buildings, just pigs. And so because we don't do that, we need little or no antibiotics in our process. We use some at the very front of the process where we draw the sample from the animal, just to make sure that if there is something in the animal that didn't show up in the health certificate with the veterinarian, that we didn't miss it, and that we're not taking some problem from the animal into the original sample. But after that, we're making meat in a sterile process. And so there's not a need to use a bunch of antibiotics all the way through, which has some really interesting repercussions to that, including that we think that the shelf life and stability of the product could be as long as twice as much as conventional beef. And that it could play a huge role in reducing food waste as well. Imagine having ground hamburger meat on a shelf in a grocery store for twice as long without it going bad. But antibiotics, drastically less or none, which is a huge health benefit in a variety of ways. In terms of energy, there's a lot of energy in conventional meat production, but it's disaggregated all over the value chain. We're concentrating it in and electrifying and centralizing it. Right now, most of meat's on 100% wind energy because we're in the Netherlands and wind is super abundant and cheap. So we're on 100% renewable. Not all the companies are. I don't know all of their circumstances, but we will need as much renewable input as possible, which means that this transition needs to happen in tandem with the energy transition as well. And so that's very important, and it makes the value proposition of doing things like pork and chicken high. If you're not using renewable inputs, there's less of a strong argument for making chicken and pork. But even if you are using dirty energy, it's still a net gain if you're making beef. In terms of water, as I said, we can make beef about 95% less water than traditional means, because you're not raising an animal for 18 to 24 months before slaughter. And we also can recycle quite a bit of the growth media that we use. And so we have some cool experimentation right now, including with some vertical farmers in Singapore, where we're experimenting with the part of the water and the cell feed, the growth media that we can't recycle, pumping that into an adjacent vertical farm in order to be used for growing leafy greens and lettuces in a vertical farm urban environment. But there's still a lot of research that needs to be done there, but drastically less land and water, which is, as important as the climate change causing gases.
Wow. So much to think about and digest there. We have a question here that somebody is not able to turn on her mic. She has several questions, Jamie McAfee. So I will read out some of the questions. Wondering what happens to dairy cows when they stop producing milk. Are they used for ground beef? We recently visited Switzerland and noticed how expensive it was for steak. Also, alternative meats hit the market. As they hit the market, will the price point be accessible to lower income families? Will the beef industry start attacking alternative meats to save themselves? Have they already? How can companies market this product and move away from the lab-grown label? I know you don't like that term, that often scares the public. That's a lot of questions, sorry.
Yeah, you may have to remind me of them as we go through them. But
okay, the first questions had to do with
dairy cattle. Yeah, I got that one. Yeah, it's interesting because I live in the Netherlands now, which is the largest exporter of dairy in the world. But Netherlands is also the largest exporter of meat in Europe, which is an interesting product because they don't raise beef cattle, but every male calf that's born on a dairy farm is sent for slaughter. And so the meat industry coming out of the Netherlands is a byproduct of dairy. And so, yeah, the answer is yes. Dairy cattle that are past their prime are slaughtered, and most of that is more of a minced or ground product. And then the prime cuts that are coming out of the dairy industry are from the male dairy calves. They're not bred for that though, so it's not particularly good. And I'll say that as a meat eater, I'm always careful about what I order in the Netherlands because a lot of the meat is actually not very good. So it's it's another interesting aspect of our technology is there's several companies in my consortia, including one that was on the list. It's called Wilk. And their slogan is "Wilk is milk." And they're an Israeli-based company, and they're actually making making milk using our technology. There's a lot of very cool stuff happening in the dairy space. But dairy is another huge place where we need to figure out alternatives, because dairy cattle account for a huge portion of those greenhouse gases that we talked about. I think the next one is about the cattle industry attacking us. That is already happening. You see quite a bit, but it's not. I wouldn't say it's not uniform. There's a lot of the major meat companies in the world. There's really a consolidation of meat companies in the world down to about 5 companies, and they control all the processing. It's like JBS, which is a Brazilian-based company, the largest in the world. There's Cargill, Tyson, Smithfield. These are all companies you would have heard of as Americans. They have all begun to invest in our companies and our technologies because they consider themselves to be protein companies, and they need to be ahead of the curve and what is a revenue opportunity that's coming around the corner. So they're a little more brass tacks about the economic opportunity. Some of the producers, like the National Cattlemen's Association in the U.S., are vehemently opposed to our technology and have been attacking because they consider it a threat to themselves. I will say this, though. I'm from Texas, and I'm married into a cattle ranching family. My father is a scientist at heart by training, and he's very interested in what we're doing. And he's introduced me to a lot of his friends, and they came into that conversation cussing me. And then once we had an actual dialogue, and I talked to them about what we're doing and how we're trying to provide protein to the world, especially a growing middle class in Asia, they get it. That we're not going to replace ribeyes and filet mignon in the United States, right? We're making minced meat to feed a growing planet. It's not any sort of threat to premium cuts and the major producers of beef around the world. But you got to have those moments where you can have a dialogue and an actual constructive conversation, and we're working on that. But as you saw, this is happening. I mean, countries around the world have recognized that they need to do something about their carbon footprint and livestock, and so you'll see us in grocery stores and on menus in the next couple of years. And I think that at that point, they'll realize the traditional producers of beef and pork and chicken will see that this is not something that's a threat to their means. The overall demand pie is growing exponentially, and there's plenty of economic opportunity for everybody.
Dana, you missed a question.
I missed a question. Well, somebody asked, they were trying to confirm that you asked, is red meat has the same health risks as animal sourced red meat? Does it have the same?
Yeah,
health?
That's true. It's not. Yeah, so the beef that we're making in the product, conventionally produced product, but also it's the same health risk, right? I mean, again, you should not be increasing your intake of red meat. It's all of the risks that would come with eating traditional red meat would come with eating our beef, because we're replacing beef with beef at the molecular and DNA level.
I think that Lori had a question. Would you like to ask?
She wrote it in the chat.
Yes.
It just says, hi, many thanks for your presentation. Can you say something about the nutritional value of these products?
Yeah, it's so we've done a lot of testing, and I've seen our testing. I haven't seen all of the testing for every company, but and very similar, if not identical, levels of like fatty acids, triglycerides, iron. All of the vitamin levels are all in the range of conventionally produced beef. And the way the novel foods law is written in Europe is that we cannot go to market with a product that is technically a replacement for beef and be called that unless we provide the same nutritional value or better. And so it's been very important to us to make sure that we land within all of those markers so that you're getting the exact same nutritional value that what you would have gotten from any beef that you bought at the supermarket. Now, here's the interesting thing, though, is that the long-term potential of our product is that we can actually deliver more nutritional value.
I was going to ask that.
Because we're not really leaning into that point right now because we don't want to make regulators nervous. We just want to get our approvals and be selling an analog product for now. But for example, we've done quite a bit of experimentation at the R&D level, and you can actually, through the diet you feed the cells, you can trick them into basically not producing any saturated fat. You can have beef that's producing omega-3 fatty acids that you would have found in salmon, for example. And you can fortify through the diet of the cells the vitamin levels well beyond what you would have found in conventional meat, because there's even though the cow, the multi-chamber stomach of a ruminant, which is a cow, a sheep, a goat, which is also why they produce methane, it's because of the multi-chamber stomach. They do amazing things turning grass into nutrients, but there's limitations to that. We can kind of bypass that, and through the diet we're feeding the cells, we can actually up and plus up the nutritional value of the product. But we're not talking about that yet because we don't want to freak regulators out.
So you can actually customize, you have the potential to customize the nutrition according to perhaps even individual needs.
Yeah, we can have lines of products that are for certain, higher levels of iron or higher levels of B12 or zero saturated fat, for example, and have an entirely new line of marketing of products in the future.
Amazing.
But first, we want to come to market with a product that everyone's familiar with and normalize it, because it's how it's produced can be new and scary, which I think was one of the questions that she had earlier. And so we're not going over the top and beyond yet. We're just marketing it as beef. And then once it's a more normalized product, then you can start to get a little more experimental in the marketing.
So Lori asks if you're comparing your product nutritionally to normally fed beef or pasture-raised beef, and do you consider these products to be ultra-processed food?
Yeah, so we will market them with the same nutritional value for sure, because we want consumers to know that they're getting an analog replacement. And again, the law will require us, in order to label it as cultivated beef, which is what we're advocating for the label, in order to have beef in the label that we want in Europe, it has to be the same nutritional value or better. And we know we can meet that bar right now based on the analytics that we get from independent laboratories. What was the second part of the question? Sorry.
Do you consider your products to be ultra processed?
Oh, right. Yeah. So no, we don't. So we downstream, we use the same processing techniques that conventional meat producers use. The product is harvested from the bioreactors. It is run through meat grinders. It's packaged, labeled. So it is not, it's not a plant-based product, right? We don't have to do a bunch of things to it in order to make it taste like meat. It is meat. And so we don't think any of the processing labeling or ultra processing labeling will be applicable to us.
Okay. Charity has a question. Charity, would you like to unmute and ask?
Yeah, so I was just wondering if you're saying you can have similar meat products and dairy products as we currently buy? And what about eggs?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a number of companies that are making egg whites, because making the primary protein in an egg white is albumin. And you can pretty easily use this technology to make albumin. So there's a number of companies in the US like Perfect Day and Every, and there's already some ice cream and some macaroons and dairy and pastry products on the market using that. No one's really nailed making the yolk yet, because that's more the protein combination in a yolk is more complex. But you could buy egg whites today that are made using cellular agriculture.
Very interesting. I have more questions, but would somebody else have something they'd like to ask? Angela?
Okay, I have a question. So you've tasted this meat before? And it tasted good?
Yeah, I'm very fortunate. I lead our product development team because of my culinary background. So I've tasted quite a bit of the product. You know, except for this tail that I grew randomly, it seems fine. I'm just teasing you, Angela. No, it's great. It's actually, you know, I'm not going to lie to you. It's not remarkable because it's beef, and beef is only, you know, minced meat is only so remarkable. But that's what's remarkable about it, right? Is that it's beef, and so you know, I've done a lot of cooking with it, and I've cooked for our potential investors and our investors, and made lots of burgers and meatballs. And it's extraordinary how it is the product that you're familiar with if you're a meat eater. For me, as a culinarian and a chef, I'm actually most excited about our fat, because anyone who's done any sort of cooking knows that you know, especially with beef, about 95% of what you know of as beefiness is actually the fat. Like when you smell a burger sizzling on a grill and that Maillard reaction that's happening, the chemical reaction of caramelizing, that's the fat. And that's the cells bursting with heat and aerosolizing that aroma that we know as beef. And so we think actually that the cultivated beef fat that we're making is going to be the revenue driver for the first decade. Because there's companies like Impossible and Beyond and all these plant-based companies that cannot figure out how to make a burger that a hardcore carnivore is going to love, because they're trying to use coconut oil and they're trying to use palm oil and things that have a really you know, a complex you know, background in a sustainable supply chain. But if you could add cultivated beef fat that was totally ethical in terms of animal welfare and climate to a plant-based product, it's a game changer. So we think there's an opportunity to make plant-based products better in terms of the sensory experience that meat eaters might love. So I think we'll be a company that sells the final product of burgers and meatballs, but a more of a business-to-business product of cultivated fat as well.
Somebody like me who's not, I stopped eating meat because I don't like it. So I don't need to replace it, but I do eat all kinds of fish and seafood. And there are also different issues with the sustainability of our food that comes from the sea. And I'm wondering, has this frontier been crossed? Are you?
Yeah, it has. So in Cellular Agriculture Europe, we have 2 members that are producing seafood. One is a German company, Blue Seafood. They're in Hamburg and Berlin. They're focused on tuna and salmon. And the value proposition, and there's companies all over the world making, you know, shrimp paste, lobster, you know, like a lobster bisque, basically. There's a company in San Francisco called Wild Type that's making the most incredible salmon I've seen. They have the best product photos. They've even perfected those white lines, which is also an albumin protein, and you know, where salmon flakes off when you cook it. But the value proposition for cultivating seafood is actually arguably higher than other products, because the challenges in seafood are really complex, including heavy metal contamination, which is why pregnant women can't eat sushi, is because the amount of, or fish, because the amount of mercury that we're finding. And then now the problem that is really pervasive is microplastics. And we're even identifying microplastics in humans now because of the incredible exposure that we have, especially through seafood. So if you're cultivating fish through using this technology, you're basically producing fish with no microplastics or heavy metals, and without the need to over harvest really valuable species like bluefin tuna. I mean, if we keep harvesting bluefin tuna like we are, they're going to go the way of the dinosaurs. They are there's so much pressure on them. So if you can make a high value product like an otoro, which is the fatty belly of a bluefin tuna, it's a super premium product. You can go to market with, even at a high price. And it's incredibly healthier for the oceans and for people.
Amazing. I see Lori has her hand up for a question. Lori, you want to unmute?
Yes, sorry. Just a second. I'm at work and I've had to, okay. I did have a question. Thank you so much for the presentation. I mean, I'm someone whose health has been restored by eating whole foods and real foods. And, my health was destroyed by ultra processed food, to put it mildly. And so I'm really interested in the quality of the meat that you're cultivating. Now, as I understand it, you'll be working on single cells rather than tissues. And, so you've got protein and you've got fat. What about the other things that might go into ground beef, such as, sources of collagen? And it seems, I don't have confidence that you're capturing the richness of living tissue, and what that offers for human nutrition and human health. I mean, I know you've got the lines in the salmon. Well, that doesn't do much for metabolically in the body, although it might get people to try it and enjoy eating it. So that's sort of my questions. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a fair question. So I just want to clarify that Mosa Meat in particular, and most of the companies in our consortia are actually making fully differentiated tissue. We don't just make blue cells. Some of the products that have been approved, like the 2 products in the US, I can't speak to those because they're not in my consortia. But we're proliferating cells and then we're differentiating them into full. We can produce collagen as well. That it won't be in the first generation of our meat products, but we can produce collagen. So that being said, that's why I think the nutritional value is much different than what we're talking about. If we're just proliferating cells and essentially using them as a flavoring. We consider that to be only halfway through the process, and we're focused on the holy grail of replacing beef with beef. So I think there's a lot of things to be explored as this technology is fully fleshed out around making, as you described, sort of the full buffet of options that an animal produces, including collagen. And I think those will be also B2B products that we explore in the future as well. And especially for me, collagen is the critical component of making any sort of animal-based stock, which is the base for every sauce that every high-end restaurant and chef wants to flavor their dishes with. So I think there's huge potential for us there in terms of a B2B product. But we can make that today. But this is like I said, it's a nascent end of the industry. And I think you'll see incredible growth now that we've perfected scaling up at the more pilot, the industrial scale, from pilot to industrial scale. And you'll see lots of exploration on things in the future, like skin for leather as an example.
So Jamie McAfee, she's continued to write questions in the chat. She can't unmute, so I will ask them for her. Will ground beef be the first product to hit the market? When and where are you expecting it to land first? And she also thanks you very much for this talk, that it's been incredibly insightful.
Yeah, so the first products are being sold right now in Singapore and the US, but those approvals have just been chicken so far. So I think my company will have the first approvals for beef in the world. And we've taken, bovine cells are harder to work with than avian cells, so we've taken the time to really perfect that. And yes, the first products will be minced beef or ground beef. And there's several reasons for that. One, that's kind of scientifically, that's where we're at. But two, 50% of the global beef market is ground meat. And so it's a perfectly acceptable place to eat the market. And there is a cultural adaptation for minced meat everywhere in the world, whether it's bolognese, meatballs, burgers, samosas, anywhere you go from any corner of the earth, there's an adaptation using minced beef. So we're perfectly happy to enter the market with that product.
So when do you expect that it will be, when do you think it will hit the market?
Yeah, so I expect my approval in Singapore by Q4 this year. So we expect an answer from Singapore, in the next few months, and we're ready to launch. We're ready to go to a launch event in Singapore and go to market immediately. We have strategic partnerships with restaurants and chefs, and we'll have a gastro approach first. We want chefs to be to introduce this product and explain why it's important to them. And then we'll move to retail in the next 2 to 3 years after it's been more normalized through kind of a culinary experience and a gastro introduction. In the US, I expect that we'll have approval in the next 12 to 16 months. In Europe, probably in the same time frame, 16 to 20 months.
Amazing. Really extraordinary. Angela is in the queue. She wants to ask something.
Yeah, I was curious about gelatin. That's an area that a lot of people don't want to use because it's made with meat, but this maybe is something a little bit different, is that something you're working on?
Yeah, it's a great question. We haven't put other than collagen, we haven't put a lot of emphasis on gelatin just because there's such great plant-based replacements for it already. And so we don't see a lot of market opportunity there right off the bat. And so we placed emphasis more on, where the unit economics make more sense, where there is not very good replacements like the fat and the muscle. But it's something we may look at in the future, and it may end up being a byproduct that becomes a good B2B revenue opportunity. But frankly, I think most of the plant-based gelatin replacements are very suitable for almost any recipe.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if they are. I don't think they have the same consistency, but that's just me, I guess. Thanks.
I have a question about regulation between Europe and the United States. I understand my son had to have stem cell therapy to his shoulder, or wanted to have it, and he wasn't able to have it in Europe. He actually flew to Texas to have it, where they're doing it regularly. It's been approved for quite many years, but it's not approved in Europe. And I think that they're much more conservative in using CRISPR-Cas9 and other types of, gene manipulation or stem cells to manipulate organic forms. And I'm wondering, has this been your experience in Europe, or is it what has been your experience with this?
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of truth to that. So there's the European approach generally in any sort of gene editing has been much more conservative, and that's mostly embodied in the GMO debate. There's little or no GMO products on the market in Europe. approvals are very few and far between. It's why you can't buy Impossible burgers in Europe, because the product that makes them look bloody and red is a hemoglobin that is produced through GMO. And
You can buy them in
their dossier. Huh?
I think are there two? Because there's one that they're selling regularly in Finland.
Yeah, the Impossible beef is not in the EU, and if they're selling a product there, it's without the hemoglobin. They have an Impossible pork sausage that they have without the GMO hemoglobin. There's lots of Beyond products because there's no GMO involved.
Okay, it's the Beyond Burger. It's the Beyond Burger that they're selling here, right?
Yeah, it's a subpar to Impossible in the products, because frankly, a lot of these products have been made better by some of these GMO components, but that's just not widely accepted in Europe. There's dossiers still pending in the European Food Safety Authority back end that are 7 and 10 years old. They've just stopped work on them because they don't want them in Europe. Now, I will say, and that's why we have a non-GMO approach for our beef. We're not doing any sort of unnatural immortalization of the cells. And so we'll have a non-GMO approach. But the products that are approved in the US so far and in Singapore are GMO. That's why they moved faster, and it's chicken. But I will say the sentiment is starting to change. What you may have seen is that the European Commission just launched a new legislative framework examining new genomic techniques for feed. We tried to get them to expand it to food and feed, and they weren't willing to do that. But at least they're beginning to realize that, especially in the context of climate resilience, that if they don't start using CRISPR-Cas for crops, that they're going to see massive loss in productivity and yields in a climate change environment. And so over the next 18 months, this new genomic technique sustainable framework is being debated in the European Commission and the European Parliament. I hope that process opens people's minds a little bit, because I think the next wave of that is to examine new genomic techniques for food as well.
Sarah says, thank you so much. I have to sign up. Particularly intrigued in the seafood. So
thanks, Sarah.
Also that 2050 land use stat is shocking, and it is. And I have to ask Robert, we would be so grateful if we could actually post your slide deck to our event page so that people can access it. It is really full of astounding and intriguing facts that I'm sure many of us kind of maybe knew on the fringes, but did not understand to the full extent. Really nicely put together.
I happen to share the slides. Yeah, and I think Elena has a question.
I wanted to ask about whether any thought had been given to the countries and regions where the production of beef was a major part of their economy, like Uruguay and Brazil.
Yeah, you mean in terms of negatively impacting their production and their economy?
Replacement with other options. It may be that they would be satisfying the demand for essentially premium beef, steaks and that sort of thing. But it also occurred to me that there might be a huge hit in those places, and also maybe parts of the States and Canada.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly one thing we approach this conversation being very cautious about, replacing one set of unintended consequences with another. And so we're very conscientious about the social impact of what we're doing. And we have quite a few partnerships where we've examined this. What we've found so far is that there's no real evidence that we're going to replace any of the existing animal agriculture infrastructure because the demand is skyrocketing so much. If overall meat demand was going down, then I think we would be in an environment where we would be really negatively impacting current production methods. But actually for us, again, for the majority of our market is going to be in Asia, and that rising middle class there. The status quo really is the biggest challenge to current meat production. And the biggest problem is consolidation in the meat processing sector. Again, 5 companies control like 90% of all meat processing in the world right now, and that is a really unhealthy environment because they're dictating prices for cattle ranchers and farmers. And they're not getting fair value for their product, which doesn't create, an environment that's very conducive for family farms. Europe alone has lost 5 million family farms in the last 20 years in farming. I'm less concerned about us impacting farming and more concerned about how we provide a just transition for farmers who are looking to get out because they're not getting fair prices for their current meat production. And remember, at the end of the day, we have to feed crops like wheat and pea and soy and sugar beets. And so we see an incredible symbiosis with conventional farmers, where if somebody wants to get out of current animal agriculture and instead use their family land to make crops that we can use for inputs for our cell feed, that we see that as an opportunity to create those sorts of relationships. So there's a lot of things to be figured out, but I think there's a lot more symbiosis than competition.
Yeah, and so much of the crops that are produced are there to feed the cattle in Brazil and Uruguay and other areas, and in the United States, soy and corn, as you said. And how do we transform that agricultural land into growing crops that will feed humans?
Yeah, I mean, we hope because we can make intensive protein, production to meet this growing demand, but with about 95% less of the land. We hope that land we can help free up over time can be rewilded as carbon sinks, and then dedicated to more regenerative agriculture. Because at the end of the day, if you're going to have less, intensive industrial animal agriculture and go to more regenerative, that's great. But your yields go down and you need more land to do it in order to really do, proper grazing practices. And so we hope that the land that we free up with our intensive protein production can help contribute to that equation.
I see Diana has her hand raised. She's our energy expert.
Well, not on this. And I'm sorry I missed the beginning of your speech, but I'll go back and hear the recording. I have a couple of questions. You mentioned fats, and there was a period some years ago when the sugar industry decided to put the blame on fats for a lot of the damage and chronic illness caused by sugar. And so researchers now are coming out with a different profile of fats that are good for humans. And I mentioned the keto diet, the work around keto. And so I'm wondering, I'm hoping you all are aware of that debate because, for example, getting rid of saturated fats just like that might not be good. I'm not an expert on that, but it's just something to signal. The other thing is that beef fed on corn carries inside of it a lot of the bad things that are in corn, like lectins, and you want to get back to grass-fed beef. So I don't know when you construct your molecules, if you are going to be using, using as a model, the corn-fed and soy-fed beef, when beef are not made to eat those foods. They're supposed to be prairie-fed on a multitude of grasses and so forth. And how do you address that in your model?
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot. It's something that we are very conscientious about. We have no corn, so basically we're creating cell feed. We're reducing down to the hydrolysates, the raw inputs that the animal would have turned feed into. We're not using any corn, and the only soy that we've involved in our process, we've specifically found vendors for the hydrolysates from soy that are soy that's not coming from Brazil, and the non-traditional soy that can be grown in Europe. And so there's a lot of experimentation going on in the Netherlands right now, bringing back new soy crops that are resilient to the Dutch environment, which is a little bit more harsh for a lot of the traditional monocrop soy that's grown around the world. So there'll be no corn at all, or any inputs from corn in our product for a variety of reasons which you've outlined. But for us, we want a really diverse diet as well. So it's why we've been experimenting with, on the glucose side. Glucose is critical to triggering the cells to, metabolic activity in the cells to especially differentiate from. So we've been experimenting using inputs like sugar beets from Dutch farmers and trying to create as local supply chains as possible in order to make sure that the impact of the supply chain that we're creating doesn't have a bunch of unintended consequences as well. So there's a lot of experimentation yet to be done there. But this is the optimal cell feed that comes out with a product that has the taste, texture, and flavor that we want, but also creating supply chains that are much more sustainable than have been created by conventional animal agriculture.
How do you get mitochondria into this stuff?
Oh, that's beyond my expertise. I'm not on the hard science side. I can ask somebody that question.
Yeah, but I mean, I'd worry if there's too much glucose too, but okay, maybe you can try grasses and with your beef. Thank you. Very interesting.
I have one last question, and we will be unfortunately ending soon, but how expensive is it to produce and to these nutrient-based, the whole process, and how do you expect to then ultimately bring the cost down, and how much will the consumer end up paying compared to normal meat?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a comparison. So the first burger that I described that we founders debuted to the world in 2013 cost about $300,000 US. So that was obviously, think back to the early phase, like what the first solar panels cost. And, the early prototypes are always the most expensive, and then you get into the scale up phase and you start to realize economies of scale. We brought costs down by orders of magnitude, thousands of percent. So when we go to market in Singapore, our first burgers will they'll definitely be in the premium price range. They'll probably be, upwards 15-20% more than conventional beef. But we think pretty quickly as we ramp up production, because we just opened our first pilot production facility. It's ready to go. We're just waiting on regulatory approvals. We think as we ramp up production that those economies of scale will be realized pretty quickly, and that in the 3 to 5 year range, we'll be at price parity with conventional beef. Now, here's the exciting part, is that we also think that in the 5 to 7 year range, that our prices will continue to come down, and we long-term will be cheaper than conventional beef. Because again, going back to the inefficiencies of the animal, we're able to realize, bypass that and realize efficiencies that you can never reach with the animal, because we're not making all of the extra parts that you don't need. So long term, our products may be cheaper than conventional beef, but for the first 5 years or so, it'll be more of a premium product. And that's also another reason to start with targeted chefs who are really committed to sustainability, who can introduce the product to consumers, explain why it's important to them, normalize it for us so that when we're ready to go in grocery stores, it's a little less foreign and new.
Well, this has just been extraordinary. I think all of us are converts, at least in theory. I would like to see more written. I am going to follow it closely, and I want to know when you're going public so I can buy stock. It's extraordinary, and there's solving our climate crisis is a complicated puzzle that needs to be addressed from many angles, and it is really heartwarming to hear about the efforts made to address agriculture and the meat industry, and this seems to be an extremely viable solution. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think, one of the things that, again, have to be in the toolbox. I appreciate everyone taking the time to listen to what we have to say, and check us out at mosameat.com, and we'll have a pretty prominent role at COP28 in Dubai this year. We're co-hosting the Food Systems Pavilion at COP28.
Okay, I'll see you there. Are you going, Robert?
Yeah, I'll be there all 12 days. So I think it'll be the first really robust conversation about how agriculture intersects with climate at a high level. And so I'm excited that the conversation is finally accelerating. It took 27 conference and party meetings before food was even mentioned as part of the conversation about climate, which is ridiculous, but at least we're making progress now.
Fantastic. I look forward to seeing you there and checking out the food pavilion. And yes, it's unconscionable that this entered the conversation so late, but one step, in front of the other. So good night, everybody, or good day, wherever you're calling in from.